Our speaker today is Mohammad Darawshe, a Shalom Hartman Institute faculty member and director at the Givat Haviva Educational Center. He has previously served as co-director of the Abraham Fund initiatives and as elections campaign manager for the Democratic Arab Party and the United Arab List. He is an expert on Jewish-Arab relations and has spoken in a range of academic and policy centers on this, and is involved in addressing what recent news has highlighted as a fundamental challenge of building kind of a shared society within Israel, an inclusive society within Israel. And so without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to him.
Thank you very much, John, and thank you, Hannah. It's a great pleasure to be with you and the NYU family. When we speak about shared society, actually, it's a combination of two terms that have been merged together. One is all of the theories about good relations. How do you create good relations between communities? Terms that are used often there are coexistence or dialogue or mutual interests, and I will go into the details of each one of them, plus the value of equality. So good relations and equality are what form the term shared society, and this is what I'm going to be talking about. Now, the big question is, why do we need intervention? Why should civil society organizations be at all involved in these type of activities? Is there a problem? And the answer, yes. There are two problems, actually. One I would characterize as the vertical problem, which is the question of whose state is it? Is Israel the state of the Israelis, or Israel is the state of the Jews? That's a political debate about the identity of the state, which also reflects itself in the identity of the public sphere. So the flag, the national anthem, are Jewish flags and Jewish national anthems that represent 75% of the population. 21% are Palestinian Arab citizens that feel no relationship, not to the ethos of the state, the Zionist ethos that speaks about the homeland for the Jewish people. And in some extent, this is even negating the Palestinian national ethnic ethos of the Palestinian identity, which most Arab citizens of Israel subscribe to. Let me just clarify, John, this is where I'm not talking about the West Bank and Gaza. We're talking about Israel proper. Israel proper, which was founded in 1948, found itself already then with about 16% Palestinian minority, leftovers of the Palestinian people that did not choose to leave and were not pushed out to leave in 1948. Only 16%, mostly in the mountains in the Galilee, in the northern part of Israel. At the time, it was about 70% of the Arab Palestinian population who became Israeli citizens was in the Galilee. With time, that ratio changed because of growth rate, specifically in the Negev, in the southern part of Israel. But till today, more than 55% of the Palestinian Arab population in Israel who carry Israeli citizenship live in the northern district in the Galilee area. And this population basically found itself in a country that says to them, I am the state of the Jewish people, I'm not your state. You happen to be here. We accept your presence. That was the Declaration of Independence. But remember, this is a Jewish state, but at the same time, we're a democratic state. And the balance between Jewish and democratic has not been clarified yet. There is a debate about this since 1948. This debate tried to end in legislating the nation-state law on the 19th of July 2018, which basically says do not have any misunderstandings. This is the state of the Jewish people, and as such, it has the right to discriminate. One, in immigration laws, who can become an Israeli citizen, and second, in settlement activity, in where the state chooses to invest in and provide incentives to attract Jewish settlement. And the key problem for the Arab citizens in this case is in two areas. One, in the Galilee, and facing the policy of what's called Judaizing the Galilee, which tries to attract a strong Jewish population to move out of the center, out of the Tel Aviv bubble, and move to live in the periphery in the north or in the south, where they're talking now about Judaizing the Negev. And to Judaize the Negev or to Judaize the Galilee, it means that you need to confiscate lands from the local inhabitants. It means that you need to build fast roads to the Jewish settlements, bypassing the Arab towns that the land was taken from them. It means that you provide economic incentives to move there, which means that you put a lot of investment to attract businesses, to create jobs on those Jewish towns, to attract the Jewish people that want to move and live in that area, on the expense of not investing in the nearby Arab towns and villages, which creates a severe discrimination in the way that in the appropriations that come from the government to the local population. So that's the vertical debate. On the social, on the horizontal debate, we have another problem. The other problem is segregation. 92% of Arab citizens live in separate Arab towns and villages. And if that's not enough of segregation or separation, you know, if you want a milder word, 99.9% of the students live in separate towns and villages. So there is residentially and educationally huge mass of separation between the communities. And in the educational aspect, we even go through linguistic separation. All of the Arab education systems in Israel, the government educational system, which is 90% of that, or even 95% of the Arab educational system controlled by the State of Israel, all of it is conducted in Arabic language. And in the Jewish community, it's conducted in Hebrew. All the teachers in the Jewish schools are Jewish. All the teachers in Arab schools are Arab. The curriculum is different. It's not the same history. It's not the same mother language taught, and it's not the same civics. And let me also dare say, it's not the same English and not the same physics. The separation is very, very severe. And often, you know, one of the problems is not just the culturalization, you know, what kind of product do you want out of this student, out of this educational system? And so in the Jewish educational system, they're looking for very proud, loyal citizens. On the Arabic side, they're looking for very obedient, low obedient citizens. So not the word pride and super achiever drops, and just be a low obedient, hardworking, low class citizen. So the separation is there, and as such, you get two things. One, you get a lot of ignorance of the other side. There's no regular, normal territory or space for people to grow up. That allows the creation of a great deal of stereotypes. That allows the creation of a great deal of fear. The other is seen mostly as a political case which you do not agree with, or a security case which you are scared of. This results with stereotypes and racism. Racism rate among Israeli Jewish high school kids against Arab citizens is about 68%. There's an evaluation done, or a survey done by Professor Ephraim Yaar from Tel Aviv University every year. He shows that 68% of Israeli Jewish kids have racist views against Arab kids, and 57% of Arab kids have racist views against Jewish kids. With a margin of error of about 4%, it's pretty much as bad. We produce, through this segregated system that operates under the cloud of an active cross-border Israeli-Palestinian conflict, we produce fear, anger, frustration, hate, and racism as a result of that. Now, how do you cure that? And that's exactly the that's the topic that I want to deal with. And to do that, I want to share with you a document, you know, that I just prepared for this. So, sorry. Again, just 1 second, technical small issue. Okay, So we talked about why there are three types of dialogue approaches that we touch on. One is traditionally, everyone said, okay, let's avoid talking about the problem. Let's use the social contact theory. You probably teach this theory in social sciences and in all universities in America and most of the places around the world. The idea behind this is, what you call mother and apple pie in America. Let's meet, get to know each other. Let's create familiarity with each other's culture, names, tradition, dances, songs. Let's break some of the stereotypes, whether it is about color, about practices. Basically, the result is to humanize. The goal is to humanize the other and to say, I don't need to keep looking at you through the prism or through the lens of politics or through the lens of identity or through the lens of security. I can look at you through the lens of a fellow human being. So in Israel, we often use the term, this is hummus coexistence. We try to create hummus coexistence, culture sharing. The culture sharing is to try to break those stereotypes and break those barriers and familiarize people with each other. Now, with time, we learned that this theory has a couple of problems. One of them is that it does not affect the wider reality, wider reality. It affects the individual. So kids go home, or participants go home, and they say, okay, I met 20 wonderful Israeli Jews. And their family will say, okay, come back to your senses. These are probably the only 20 good Jews in the world. The rest of them are our enemies. Or an Arab kid, then a Jewish kid will go, I met 20 wonderful Arab fellows. They say, remember, they're our enemies. These are the only 20 good Arabs. The rest of them are a security threat. We need to be afraid of them. Come back to your senses. Come back to your reality. Come back to understanding the bigger framework. And this is easy to start the vibration, I'm sorry, the word is evaporation process of the impact, which means an expiration of the program. So we can bring to our campus, Givat Haviva campus, we can bring kids and spend 2 or 3 days together. We can get them through a very strong and very powerful and impactful experience of humanization. We get to the stage after the 3rd day that kids do not want to go home, but and they sometimes even cry about having to separate from each other after discovering the other is really a human being and you become friends with, that you can eat from the same plate of hummus and it was not poisoned. You can sleep in the same dormitory and you check yourself in the body. You check yourself in the morning. There are no holes in your body. No one stabbed you. That you can create this kind of trust with that individual or that small group of people. But you go home. The returning home syndrome is going back to your original stereotypical thoughts and so on. The other problem is that reality outside our campus engineered environment, I mean, we engineer equality. So participants can speak in both either Arabic or Hebrew. Our facilitators translate. So we give equal status to the identities, to the linguistic identity, the cultural identity. Outside, there is hierarchy. There's no equality. They sleep in the same dormitory. Outside, the Jewish kids go to their privileged neighborhoods. The Arab kids go to their underprivileged neighborhoods. The social economic disparity is huge. 47% of Arab kids live below poverty line, with only 8% of Jewish kids that live below poverty line. So yes, they can eat in the same dining room from the same buffet while they are in our campus. It feels like it's a fake, temporary, engineered, equal environment. But when they go back home to their hierarchic differences in society, and it puts the meeting in. It creates some kind of a fake environment, fake atmosphere that does not allow the participants to relate to it as realistic program. So now, with time, we realize that this theory is not enough. The social contact theory is not sufficient, and it avoids talking about the problems. It avoids talking about the political reasons behind what what brought us to where we are today. So with time, we learned to integrate a second theory, which is called the identity and narrative theory, narrative dialogue or identity debate. And in this debate, you basically allow the elephant into the room. You open the door and you allow the discussion about the problems, whether it is the problems of hierarchy or the narratives, the historic narratives of what brought us to where we are today. Why is there discrimination? And you can start with issues of today, but quickly they move into the historic narrative of Israeli-Palestinian identities, Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Who started the events of this past weekend? Easy to go with the blame game, and then we go through a process which we call backtracking. You know, when you get stuck in an argument, you say, okay, but we've done this because a week before you did something worse, because 10 months ago you started something worse, because in 1967 you started the war. Who started the war in 1967? We still don't agree on that. Who started the war in 1948? We also do not agree on that. And who did God promise this land for? We also disagree on that. And who did Abraham want to sacrifice? Was it Isaac or was it Abraham? We still do not agree on that. In a narrative debate, the maximum you can get from it, and one of the problems is agree to disagree. Yes, in this, you get to understand the differences. You get to even legitimize narratives, not necessarily accept them, but legitimize the presence of a different narrative or a different story. You get to acquire a great deal of knowledge about yourself and about the other, but it is something I do not recommend you do at home. It is something that carries a great deal of danger because it needs highly informed participants. You need to know your own narrative to engage in a dialogue, to engage in a discussion. So it cannot work with little kids. It cannot work with average people. It usually is people with more of leadership status, people that have studied their own culture and their own identity and their historic perspectives before they engage in a discussion with the other. And that's why I say it's something that if you do it, you could create more damage than good. It has to be with highly skilled facilitators, highly skilled techniques that need to be acquired. Just to give you, something I always say, conflict identity narrative debate, it's like peeling an onion. It's very stinky, and the deeper you get, it's also gets painful, and you can cry from it. The other problem is that you cannot put it back. It's easy to unpeel the conflict. It's easy to unpack the conflict. It's very difficult to repack the conflict. The question always is, what do you go home with? Do you go home with agree to disagree? Ending up saying, okay, and we've seen this in some of our evaluation, I used to hate Jews, now I know why. Or I used to hate Arabs, now I know why. So it's very informative, but it can create more gaps if you do not know how to repack the experience and put it into perspective. The third approach that we engage in is the mutual interest theory. Some of the listeners here or the viewers might have heard of it in a different name in theory. It's called the superordinate goal theory. And the superordinate goal theory says, listen, we might like or dislike each other, which is the social contact theory. We might agree or disagree, which is the narrative identity debate theory. But we have a normal life to conduct. We go to the same shopping malls. We have the same government. We have the same environment. We have the same economy. We go to the same universities, same job market. How do we make this function? Where is the mutual interest for us? And let's dialogue and try to create some kind of discussion around this. The goal is to create cooperation between the participants. The goal is to create interdependency. The goal is to have something that has sustainability, where you have something in it for you to engage in this kind of a process. The problem is with it, it avoids conflicts deliberately. It seems that it's fake because you're avoiding that elephant. You're not allowing the elephant to dominate the discourse and the discussion. It feels that it's temporary if it's not sustainable. Sometimes you might create a business, and when the business is gone, the friendship is gone. You simply, you close the business and you close the friendship at the same time. and it doesn't deal with the roots of the problem. So it might create good relationship between the ones that have mutual interest, but not necessarily have spillover effect on the wider society. Now, are there any places that this theory works? Yes. Let's look at the medical industry. The medical industry in Israel has developed and evolved into something very unique. Although the Palestinian Arab citizens are 21% of the population in Israel, they constitute about a third of the medical industry. 23% of the doctors, 37% of the nurses, 36% of the dentists, and 55% of the pharmacists. What happened there? The Arab community, which felt it's limited with its job and career acquisition, they can't get a military career because they don't serve in the military. They don't get a government career because there were limitations on how you can get accepted in civil service. You couldn't get a police position because there were limitations in getting and becoming an officer in the police. So people said, okay, and if all of the intellectual elite went into the medical industry, which felt that the Jewish population will not be able to limit because of their need for medical staff. So the Jewish community created space, the Arab community created capacity, and you ended up with a win-win situation where both are benefiting from this mutual interest. We're trying to learn as much as we can from this, what we call island of success in interdependency and mutual interests, and try to examine islands of failure and see why these islands of failure exist, and try to apply the mutual interest theory into this matter. So at the Israeli universities, in 2003, almost 20 years ago, the percentage of Palestinian Arab students was only 3.5%. And it was sort of keep them out in order to keep them outside the mainstream society, and actually in a way of punishment for having a different identity. But with time, Israeli economists started realizing that it's bad business for the Israeli economy. This is a population that instead of generating income to the state by paying taxes, having good jobs and paying taxes, they are welfare cases. The poverty rate was extremely high then. It was about 67%. Today, it's good news that it's only 47%. But that's bad for the Israeli economy, bad for the Jewish population of the state. So it became an interest to the Israeli economy to create space for the Arab community to develop significant careers that can generate significant income to get the Arab community out of poverty, but also to contribute to the larger Israeli economy. At the time in 2003, the share of the Arab community to the GDP, instead of being 21%, it was only about 7.9% of the GDP. Today, it's closer to 12%. So there is some kind of a growth, but mostly as a result of reducing the barriers of entering the labor market and having quality jobs that result from also reducing the barriers in entering universities that allow you to get universities. In doing so, in getting to the universities, two things needed to happen. One is to eliminate some of the barriers in entering universities. Some of the barriers, for example, used to be the tests. How do you test students to enter university? And there was a test called the psychometric exam, similar to SATs. So international students that came, let's say, from the United States, were able to take the exam in English, in their mother language. Arab students who went to separate Arab educational school and had Hebrew as their second language were forced to take it in Hebrew. That eliminated almost 17% of their grade just because of the language barrier. So when they were able to take the exam in 20 years ago, also in Arabic, they had the choice of choosing to do it in Arabic. That eliminated the 17% gap in the result of the exam. And then the question was, how do you test their Hebrew? And for that, there was a second test, which is called the Yael, knowledge of Hebrew for academia. And if you score less, too little or too low in the Hebrew test, then you need to take an extra 1 or 2 courses in Hebrew. But you do not test the intellect in a foreign language. You test the intellect of the person, their capacity to engage as intellectuals in academia, you test it in their best linguistic capacity. Another barrier which we had was there was a limit that you could study 64 different subjects in Israeli universities only if you are 21 years of age. Why is that? Because Jewish students do military service, and the state was behaving as a Jewish academic institution. That's a university. Universities behave like that, and as such, they said that's the start date for most of the professions: social work, law, medicine, and so on. To eliminate this barrier, we needed to go to the Supreme Court. So dialogue was not good enough, and the Supreme Court doomed this practice as unconstitutional and negates some of the basic human rights for the Arab citizens in Israel. So sometimes the way to engage is through showing the benefit, but sometimes you need to challenge and confront even through the Supreme Court when things become problematic. I want to end with, or start to wrap up and then open it up for discussions. When we recommend an approach, we do not recommend take one of those three theories I mentioned above, but we recommend a multidisciplinary approach. Some kind of a combination of the three theories, depending on the client. It has to be adapted by the client. So if your client is a young child who barely speaks his own language, let alone understanding another language, you definitely cannot engage them in an identity narrative debate. They don't even know what's their own identity yet. The only thing you can do is bring them to an art workshop, bring them to a soccer activity, some kind of a cultural sports arts activity where they can go home and say, okay, you know what? I spent a day with Jews and they didn't kill me. I survived such a day. I spent a day with Arabs. They didn't have tails. They didn't have horns. They're human beings. That's it. Even that experience at a very young age is critical and is important. And today we do it not necessarily with peer encounters where we bring kids to meet, but sometimes we even do hierarchic encounters, expose them to a teacher or to a speaker from the other side at very, very young age. A teacher that comes to teach them a song, a teacher that comes to teach them a poem, someone that has a different language, someone that brings in some of food that is relevant to their holiday and say, hey, today is a holiday for our fellow neighbors. Did you know that they eat this kind of cookie during this holiday? Just to give them familiarity, just to give them some kind of normalization of the presence of the other culture in their sphere. Now, before you do any cross or binational activities, you need to do uninational preparation or single national preparation to set up expectations, to allow people to understand what are we in for, so that you don't throw them in waters that are too deep for them, that they can sink into that water, not understand how to frame the exposure that they go through. And in addition, you need to do a great deal of post-dialogue maintenance. Why? I mentioned evaporation or expiration. So one of the ways to increase the shelf life of impact is to do post-activity program. Or what we found is to sort of spread the activity over time and not condense it in a short period of time. So we found that if you bring participants for 3 consecutive days, you get fantastic results. We can reduce racism rate from average of 6 to 8%. At exit from our campus, it drops to about 12%. We know how to do the work. It's, the percentage starts rising again after they go home. But if we bring the participants for a 1-day activity, then they go home and meet all of the challenges, meet all of the objections from their environment. They come for a second meeting 2 weeks later, then they go home, then they come back for a third meeting. Meanwhile, we know all of the rejections that they received from home, and we can deal with those rejections and we can process these rejections and help the participants figure out answers to their environment and how to deal with it. It's the same principle of COVID vaccinations. you don't get the 3 shots in the same day. You get them with some kind of time period so that your body knows how to deal with the virus or with the vaccination, and you build capacity and strengthen the body with time. And the same thing, you strengthen the arguments of the participants with their environment. You engage them in also in real issues, how their environment perceives being engaged in this kind of dialogue. I will end with 4 examples of projects that we're doing. A project called Children Teaching Children. You can Google it under CTC. And Children Teaching Children, I have my colleague here, Sadie, you can maybe put it in chat, put the link to the page in chat. It's a program that pairs Jewish and Arab classrooms for a period of 3 years, where they meet almost once a month, or sometimes more frequently, once every 2 weeks, and they study together languages, Arabic and Hebrew, so they can use each other to practice civics and their different perspectives of civics, and what's the nature of the civic nature of the state, democratic versus Jewish state, and geography. Where do they live? To understand that they share the same homeland, and maybe they have different stories and different names of the same mountain, of the different valley, different history. The idea is to teach narrative without calling it a narrative. Something that they know how Mount Tabor is shaped, but ones call it this way, the others call it that way. Another program is Teachers Exchange. We started with this program in 2005, placing Arab teachers in Jewish schools and Jewish teachers in Arab schools. The principle is the same principle you used in the States in the 1960s, what you called then the busing. You bus children. To talk about busing children in Israel today, they will throw you in a mental hospital because the political reality is not willing to do that. In America, it was a top-down decision. We're far away from a top-down decision. So our bottom-up approach today is let's bus teachers. Let's create that kind of interaction between the 2 cultures, even if it is a hierarchic encounter, a teacher-student encounter. It's not peer encounter, it's hierarchic encounter. For 93% of the kids exposed to this program, it's their first meaningful encounter with the other. And for 68%, this transfers their perspective from negative to positive about the other culture. Today, the program is operating in 2,500 schools. That's almost 40% of the Jewish educational system and 40% of the Arab educational system. We're in a battle with the Ministry of Education about the number of exposure hours. Most of the classes are exposed for only 1 hour a week to a teacher from the other side. We're now in a battle to try to increase this exposure to something more significant so that the experience becomes more meaningful. But at this stage, this is the largest program of cross-sector educational activities. The other program is we have an IB school, International Baccalaureate High School, which has 1/3 Israeli Jewish kids, 1/3 Palestinian Israeli kids, and 1/3 international students from 22 countries, where the goal is to focus on leadership and conflict resolution skills. We have 150 participants, definitely looking to expand this in the future. And we found a very interesting program that we've been involved in. It's called High Tech Seeds. The idea behind High Tech Seeds is to copy the success from the medical industry into the high-tech industry. The high-tech industry has basically generates 40% of the GDP in Israel. The percentage of Arab employees there is only 7%. So clearly Arab citizens are in the wrong party. They're in the wrong professions. Because if you work in high-tech, you generate about 3 times the average wage, and it is the 40% of the GDP. And if you're not in that party, you're in the wrong party economically. So what we are doing, we identify the best Arab students already when they're in 8th grade, if they're good in mathematics. And already from 9th grade, they start taking academic courses in computer science. By the time they finish high school, they have 50% of their undergraduate degree, an additional year and a half at age 19 and a half, they have their undergraduate degree in computer science ready to go in the high-tech industry. as fresh, brilliant brains that hard workers. In the process, we expose them to the job market. Once every semester, they spend a day in one of those companies. They meet with Arab already existing employees to see some role models. And the idea there is to break the glass ceiling or the glass bubble that prevents them from entering this market. It does two things. It does capacity building, but that capacity helps you to get integrated in the most important economy. It's not just about capacity building where you can create arguments. It's capacity building where you can get the best jobs. And once you're there, you change the environment of the workplace. Let me end with a personal example, actually, of my daughter. My daughter is now doing her PhD in genetics at the Technion, but in between degrees, she worked in a company called Medinol. She was the first Arab employee in this company of 653 Jewish employees. And comes Pesach, the Jewish holiday, the Passover Jewish holiday, she did what she did the day before. She reached at lunchtime into her bag and she took her pita bread and started eating in the dining room with her 11 colleagues that work in the lab. All of them were very upset with her. Why? Because she brought in bread in a kosher, in a Pesach kosher kitchen, which was, a rabbi comes, does cleaning, they get rid of all the crumbs from the bread, and you're not supposed to have exposure to bread during that week. She said, no one taught me about this in my educational system. No one taught me about this in my university. And the human resources of the company didn't teach me about this. No one told me that I cannot do that. And you put me in a situation that I was not equipped to work in a Jewish atmosphere or in a Jewish environment. The skills, her skills were not fit to work in a Jewish environment. 2 weeks later, it was the month of Ramadan, the month in which we Muslims fast. And she found herself sitting at the same dining room. She called me and she was frustrated. And I said, what's going on? She said, I'm watching 11 nice Jewish Joes chewing their lunch and not comfortable because I'm fasting. I said, go for a walk. She said, it's 110 degrees outside. It will worsen my situation because I can't drink in this weather because I'm fasting. And she ended up getting a chance, explaining to them that she does not need the lunch break in the middle of the day. She needs her lunch break at the end of the day to go home 1 hour earlier and still give the same 7 hours of work. So with this work, it's not only the political discourse, it's also the horizontal social discourse. To live in a shared society, you need to equip yourself with the tools that are needed to live in a shared society. The tools are multiculturalism, the tools are multilingualism, the tools are exposure, the tools are breaking some of the barriers, the tools are economic, the tools are educational, and there are 2 processes. One of them is the bottom up. That's where I find myself mostly spending most of my time. But the other is when you get the top down, and that's where you can score the scaling, the large scaling of the work, and where you are able to have a significant impact on society and not just, tap yourself on the back and say, I did good work. Good work is not good enough. You need effective work. Thank you, John. I'll stop here. That allows us maybe 20 minutes or 19 minutes for a discussion or Q&A.
That's perfect. Thank you so much, Mohammad, for an incredibly rich presentation and discussion. I'm going to start with some of the questions that have already been posted, but just a reminder to folks attending to feel free to throw up questions into the Q&A. So the first is a relatively narrow question. Liran Pollock was asking if you could clarify that you had said that Israeli Arab citizens can't really have a military career. Her understanding is that Arab citizens are not conscripted, but can volunteer to serve in the IDF. Do they face different kind of obstacles to a military career? Or were you referring to some kind of historical situation?
Well, there are 2 things. One is that the Arab citizens, Liron is right to say Arab citizens are not conscripted to the military. In 1956 or 57, The government decided to try itself and did send demands or requests to the Arab youth at the age of military service to come and report to duty. Almost 70% of those that received the orders reported to duty. They were sent home on the same day. They said, okay, that was a mistake. We don't want you in the military. Actually, it's some kind of a good arrangement for both sides. The state of Israel does not want to have, I would say today, approximately 110,000 Arab citizens between the ages of 18 to 21. The state doesn't want to have 110,000 citizens that have a problem of identity with the state. That would say, is this my military or is this not my military? Is this the military of the Jewish state or is this the military of the Israeli state? Also, the state feels that it might be putting the Arab community in some kind of uncomfortable situation where they need to be part of the occupation machine, which maybe can be legitimized and accepted by the massive Israeli population or the majority of the Israeli Jewish population, but not something that the Arab citizens in Israel subscribe to. And with the presence of that duty, it means that most Arab citizens also do not want to serve in the military for the same two reasons. One is that most people say we will serve in the military when it's clearly our state. When you eliminate the ethnic laws that define the state only as the state of the Jewish people, and when Israel will mature to become also the state of its citizens. And also the second argument, when Israel will end occupation against our ethnic identity, against the Palestinian people in the West Bank and Gaza. And that will do that only if we are part of a peace process with the Palestinians. And if the war will be with Iran, then we will join that. But we will not do that as long as if we will become part of the oppressing tool, the occupation, Israeli occupation in the West Bank and Gaza. We don't want to be part of the oppressing tool against our brethren. And when I say brethren, it's immediate brothers. Almost 20% of the households of Arab citizens have immediate family member from the West Bank or from Gaza. It could be a spouse, it could be a first cousin, it could be sometimes even brothers that are split across the line. So you're not talking about distant ethnic identity, but something which is fresh. In my case, my wife has two sisters that live in Ramallah, one sister that lives in Bethlehem. My children have cousins across the border. I'm not going to equip them with guns to go shoot their first cousins. Their first cousins, not, someone that I'm related to 2,000 years back, but someone I'm related to as immediate family member. So it's a good arrangement for both sides. That's why not many people talk about military service as one of the solutions that bring about integration of Arab citizens.
Great. Liran has a second question, and I imagine this will be a little bit longer conversation. And I want to pull out, she has a couple of questions in there. I want to pull out her last question, which is, can you speak to the ways in which the recent election in Israel, which brought a kind of right-wing anti-democratic nationalist coalition to power, what kind of obstacles does this present to not just educational programs, but for the broader effort of creating a more inclusive, shared, multicultural society within Israel?
Okay, I will ask Sadie also to share with you a short video, which is a news item that was published last week, which already says that the new minister of extracurricular activities, this is a new ministry that we have, is actually going to aim at cutting budgets to organizations such as ours that bring Jewish and Arab participants and youth together. But that already indicates that this government is interested in more polarization. This government is against integration, against equality. This government is for more segregation and for more Judaization of everything in Israel, whether it is the public sphere, whether it is the educational system. And they're not shy of saying we're going to be discriminatory, and they're not shy of saying even that they're racists. The Minister of Finance is on record calling to separate Jewish and Arab women in their delivery rooms in hospitals. He says Jewish and Arab women should not, after having their babies, should not sleep in the same rooms because this might create uncomfort, some kind of uncomfort or discomfort. Basically, he spoke about his wife that will feel uncomfortable if she has an Arab woman that also had a baby in the same day. He doesn't want to go in the room and see her, or doesn't want his wife to see her. He clearly he tries to cover that by saying it's different cooking, different smells, different atmosphere, different culture of who comes to visit, but it clearly comes from a racist perspective, and on record he's been quoted with racist statements in the past. The second minister also that has been also very vocal with his radical views is Itamar Ben-Gvir, the Minister of Internal Security or National Security. And he's even more dangerous because he built his career on confrontations with Arab citizens, specifically speaking about mixed neighborhoods and cities, where every time there was something happening in the West Bank, he would bring his followers to trigger some kind of confrontation between Jewish and Arab residents in mixed towns. And he will show up and pull up his gun and say, basically act as the sheriff that is coming to fix everything, with a lot of hate speech and a lot of very radical followers. These two parties, including also the Likud, the party of the prime minister, which legislated the nation state law in 2018, and also legislated 27 other laws that have racist scent to them between 1999 until 2019. This is the government. I think it's the worst government that has ever been in Israel. I think it's the worst for the Arab citizens, and I also think it's the worst for Jewish citizens. I think that creating polarization between Jewish and Arab citizens is not good for Israel. It negates the national interest, and it negates even a government commission that was created in the year 2000 and presented its recommendations in 2003. It's called the Orr Commission, a commission headed by Supreme Court Justice Theodore Orr at the time. And he said that Israel has to change its policy towards Arab citizens from relating to Arab citizens as enemies to be controlled. That was the old policy of the government, to a new policy which was enacted in 2003. And the new policy should be equal integration of Arab citizens, relating to that as the national interest. So going backwards is negating the professional suggestion of the only commission that investigated Jewish-Arab relations in Israel, which said we need to aspire for equal integration of Arab citizens. They do not want equality. They do not want integration. They want more segregation. They want more disparity. They want more I would even dare say, steal most of the funds from the state, from secular Jews and from Arab citizens, and pass it to fundamentalist Jews, whether they're the settlers or ultra-religious communities, which might even bring the country to some kind of economic crisis, not just a polarization between the communities. That's why you hear a lot today about companies pulling out their investments in Israel in the last couple of weeks. 300 economists just signed a document 2 days ago saying that this government is going to bring about a disaster to the Israeli economy. The head of the second largest bank in Israel said in a meeting to Netanyahu, to the prime minister 2 days ago, that he's witnessing people pulling out their investments and their savings from Israeli banks because they're expecting this government to bring about one judicial breakdown of the system in Israel. They are going to weaken the judicial system and basically end the separation between the judicial system and the executive system, where the judicial system will become subjected to the executive arm of the state. But for the Arab citizens, I think this is we're going to witness probably the worst period that we've witnessed in the last, in comparison to the last 75 years. More marginalization, more discrimination, less budgets, and on both the vertical political discourse, the language that is used, and that might be translated in laws. They're just about to pass a law that you cannot raise the Palestinian flag, and if you do, you might get punished, which is similar to how they passed a few years ago the Nakba law, which basically says you cannot teach the Palestinian narrative of what happened in 1948 in Arab schools. You can teach it in Jewish schools, but you can't teach it in Arab schools. So the Jewish kids can get the Palestinian version of what happened in 1948. The Arab kids themselves cannot get their own version of history, which now might translate into even preventing people from identifying themselves as Palestinians. I and my kids identify ourselves as Palestinian citizens of Israel. So maybe if I identify myself as Palestinian, then my kids might not be able to go to university afterwards. That's a slope that we're going into, trying to limit the political space and freedom of identity and expression of the Arab citizens, but also using economic and social punishments that usually come through appropriations or disproportionate appropriations from the government.
Great, thank you. Aaron Warden has a question, thanking you for your presentation, and that you had mentioned some specific barriers to communicating, to relationship building, vis-a-vis the various, policies and mechanisms of segregation and so forth. So she has a question about the media coverage of last week's attacks that killed at least 9 Palestinians in the Jenin camp in the occupied West Bank. Can you talk a little bit about narratives in Israeli media and what extent this reflects broader narratives around and communication around events in occupied Palestine?
That's actually, that's very obvious. If you hear, as a trilingual person, I also not only consume CNN and Sky News, I also consume all the Palestinian Arabic press and the Hebrew press. And it's very, very different language. For the Palestinians, the 9 killed in Jenin and a few others afterwards, 35 Palestinians have been killed since the beginning of January, 35 people. For the Palestinians, they are martyrs, they're freedom fighters, that their names are cherished and their photos are carried in the streets because they symbolize for the Palestinians their own capacity to try to object to submission to occupation. For Israelis, each one of those 35 was a terrorist, regardless if it was the woman. One of the 9 was a 60-year-old woman in Jenin, and the Israeli media relates to that woman, which was killed. And the military admits she was killed by mistake. She was looking from the window to what's happening in the street, and she got shot through the window from her, was being in her house. For the Israelis, it was 9 terrorists, and it was 35 terrorists that were planning to kill Jews, that were planning to commit terrorist attacks, even if there's no proof. Just the fact that few of them were carrying guns and within their own community, within their own towns, in occupied territories, which is not subject to Israeli sovereignty, that doesn't make any impression on Israelis. For them, they quickly buy the government narrative that these people were planning to commit acts against Israelis, so they need to be considered as a threat, as a security concern that every Israeli should be afraid of, and justify the actions of the Israeli government in having a preemptive action against them. So it was eliminating a potential terrorist, a potential killer, and that's the only narrative that Israelis relate to. Even in the demonstrations that we saw over the weekend, we see that they prevent having Palestinian flags risen to bring in the issue of ending the occupation as one of the arguments against this government. So basically say we're willing to oppose the government only for its violations or proposed violations of the judicial system, or the economic impact it might have on Israeli society, or the social injustices that it gives better preference to the settlers and to the religious population on the expense of really the real working population in Israel. They're saying that's the only issue. That even the center left is not willing to bring in the peace process into the matter. They're not willing to bring negotiations into the matter. For them, the Palestinians are the enemy, and even the leaders of the left blessed the government action in Jenin and congratulated the government for that as an accomplishment.
Great, thank you so much. I'm wondering, in the time that we have remaining, I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about, in part because you've been very involved in Arab-Israeli political parties and so forth, and I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about status of that, given that the overall performance of Arab parties in the 2022 election was not did not do as well as the performance in the 2020 election, and if you could talk a little bit about what you see likely as kind of the developments and trajectory within Arab-Israeli parties.
Well, you're asking a question that I usually give a 2-hour answer for. That's where I
Well, then we can invite you back.
freely.
This will be an excuse to bring you back.
With pleasure. In the year 2020, the turnout rate was about 64%. It dropped to 44% in 21, and it jumped back to 53%. So it tells you that there is a very what do you call it, a roller coaster approach. And I would say there are 3 main reasons why we're experiencing this roller coaster. Why did it go up in 2020? For 2 reasons. One is Benny Gantz, who was the candidate to form government. He said that he's going to invite the Arab political parties to invite them to his coalition. And all Arab parties joined in one political party, was called the Joint List. So the Arab community liked the idea that they might be influential and finally getting into coalition. And they shared the same government base, they shared the same political platform, the one political party, so the citizens did not feel that they have to choose between them, and there was a common denominator, which is the collective good of Arab citizens that is being served, and not the individual partisan perspectives of the components of the different political parties that compose the Joint List. In 2021, there was a split in the Joint List, and it split into 2 political parties, and the Arab public basically punished them with very, we call it voting with your feet instead of with your hands. They walked out to the ballots. They didn't go to the ballots, saying to the Arab leadership, we expected you to behave with more responsibility. We don't see the shades of differences between you, and they pulled out of the system. But one of those parties ended up joining the coalition, the Lapid-Bennett coalition, center-left coalition that was ruled for the last year and a half. So they engaged the Arab community into political effectiveness. You're not voting only to be an opposition party in the parliament where you only express the anger and frustration, but you might have executive influence. You might impact your life and impact decision-making specifically on matters that are important to Arab citizens. When you ask Arab citizens, what are the most important 5 issues for you? Number 1, personal safety and security. Crime rate among Arab citizens is about 6 times more than what it is in the Jewish community, mostly suffering from under-policing and negligence of the police. The second is education. They want better education so that they can use education for their social economic mobility. The third is housing. There are about 50,000 Arab homes, which is about 20% of our households, that have demolition orders against them. 20% of our households, they're built without any planning, and as such, without the presence of zoning plans, they're subject to be demolished. The fourth is the Palestinian issue, resolving the Palestinian conflict. And the fifth is cultural activities, and to have more of cultural revival of the community. And when parties relate to those priorities with the same level of significance, they get more attention, and they are able to attract more voters. When they side issue, then they lose voters. Another two main reasons, other than the Arab political parties, the Israeli center-left political parties, which used to attract about 50% of the Arab voters, have stopped talking to the Arab voters, neglected them as by one, not providing them leadership positions. So you don't see Arab candidates or adequate candidates in leadership positions on those parties. They do not carry any of those 5 agendas in their list, which are the only important agendas for the Arab community. To talk about the price of housing in Tel Aviv does not really talk to Arab citizens of the Galilee. It's a different story. To talk about daycare in Tel Aviv and in Jerusalem does not relate to the Negev, which does not have even schools to start with. I mean, that talk about education in Tel Aviv, it's luxury for the Negev, which do not have even an access road to the town, where towns are not even recognized as municipalities. And the third reason for drop is the failure in facing the nation-state law. In 2020, it was sort of a knee-jerk reaction to the nation-state law to say we are going to fight the nation-state law by increasing the turnout and increasing our presence in the Knesset. Benny Gantz at the time promised to change the nation-state law. He ended up partnering with Benjamin Netanyahu in government, forgetting his promise, and it resulted with a feeling in the Arab community that this is not fair play, that the Israeli political scene is not a fair play, that even the center-left, which promises to eliminate constitutional discriminatory laws as the nation-state law, they were willing to sell us in the first moment just to get ministerial positions. So who do we count on? And as such, you got a lot of people pulling out. Final interesting statistic in the last elections, 57% of the Arab eligible voters said that they want, 67%, that they want Arab political parties to be part of a future coalition, 67%. When the actual turnout rate was only 53%. So 67% want all in, but only 53% are willing to take the first step to do that.